Close your eyes and let the sound of waves against a wooden hull carry you back to the age of the Norsemen. The salt spray kisses your face as a mighty longship cuts through the cold northern waters, its dragon-headed prow rising and falling with the swells. Above you, a square woolen sail billows in the wind, painted with stripes of red and white, while around you, battle-hardened warriors sit at their oars, ready to row when the wind fails. The year might be 800 or 900 or 1000. The destination might be England or France, Iceland or Greenland, Constantinople or the unknown shores of a land not yet named. You are sailing with the Vikings, the fierce and fearless seafarers who burst from Scandinavia to reshape the medieval world. You have heard their stories before, tales of raids and conquest, of Thor's hammer and Odin's ravens. But tonight, we journey deeper into the Viking world. Beyond the famous raids, we discover the traders and settlers, the explorers and poets, the craftsmen and farmers who made up this remarkable civilization. We meet the gods they worshipped and the heroes they celebrated. We explore their homes and their ships, their laws and their legends. We follow them across oceans to lands no European had ever seen and watch as they carved kingdoms from the chaos of the early medieval world. Let your breathing slow and your thoughts drift like a Viking ship sailing toward the horizon as we uncover 99 more fascinating facts about the Vikings. Fact 1. The Viking Age is traditionally dated from the raid on Lindisfarne Monastery in northeastern England in the year 793 to the Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066, a span of nearly 300 years that transformed Europe. But Vikings did not suddenly appear in 793 or vanish in 1066. Scandinavian seafarers had been exploring and trading for centuries before Lindisfarne, and Norse culture continued long after the Viking Age officially ended. The term Viking Age is a modern historical convenience, a way of labeling the period when Scandinavian raiders and settlers had their greatest impact on European history. The people themselves would not have recognized it as a distinct era. Fact 2. The word Viking itself is still debated by scholars. It may come from the Old Norse word vik, meaning bay or inlet, suggesting that Vikings were people who lurked in bays waiting to attack passing ships. Alternatively, it may derive from the word vikja, meaning to turn aside or depart, describing those who left home for adventure. Some scholars connect it to the trading town of Viken in Norway. Whatever its origin, the term originally referred to an activity rather than a people. One went Viking, meaning one went raiding or trading overseas. Not all Scandinavians were Vikings, and not all Vikings were full-time raiders. Many were farmers who went Viking seasonally before returning home to tend their lands. Fact 3. The Scandinavian homelands of the Vikings encompass modern Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, as well as parts of Finland, Iceland, and the Baltic region. These lands shared common languages, religion, and culture, but they were not unified nations in the modern sense. Instead, they were patchworks of petty kingdoms, chieftaincies, and independent farmers, constantly competing and occasionally cooperating. Geography shaped their differences. Denmark, relatively flat and fertile, developed more centralized kingdoms earlier. Norway, with its mountains and fjords dividing communities, remained fragmented longer. Sweden, oriented toward the Baltic, developed strong trading connections eastward. These regional differences meant that Vikings from different areas often had different destinations, with Danes focusing on England and Francia, Norwegians on Scotland, Ireland, and the Atlantic Islands, and Swedes on the Baltic and the rivers leading into Russia. Fact 4. The climate of Scandinavia during the Viking Age was slightly warmer than it is today, part of a period called the medieval warm period that lasted from roughly 900 to 1300. This warming made agriculture more productive in the northern lands and may have contributed to the population pressure that drove Viking expansion. The warmer climate also made the North Atlantic more navigable, with less sea ice blocking the routes to Iceland, Greenland, and North America. When the climate began cooling again in the late medieval period, Norse settlements in Greenland that had thrived for centuries were abandoned, unable to sustain themselves in the harsher conditions. Climate was not the only factor in Viking expansion, but it helped make the expansion possible. Fact 5. Norse society was divided into several social classes, though the boundaries between them could be more fluid than in later medieval Europe. At the top were the jarls, the earls or nobles who controlled large estates and commanded warriors. Below them were the carls, the free farmers and craftsmen who formed the majority of the population. At the bottom were the thralls, slaves captured in raids or born into bondage who performed the hardest labor. A successful Viking raid could elevate a carl to greater wealth and status, while misfortune could reduce a free man to thraldom. Slavery was fundamental to the Viking economy, with captured slaves both providing labor at home and serving as valuable trade goods sold in markets from Dublin to Baghdad. Fact 6. Thralls had few rights in Norse society. They could be bought, sold, beaten, or killed by their owners with little legal consequence. They performed agricultural labor, domestic work, and any other tasks their masters demanded. Female thralls were especially vulnerable, often serving as concubines whose children might or might not be acknowledged by their fathers. Yet slavery in the Norse world was not quite as absolute as in some other societies. Thralls could sometimes purchase their freedom or be freed by their owners. Some freed slaves and their descendants rose to positions of respect. The Icelandic sagas mention several characters of slave origin who achieved prominence, suggesting that while slavery was harsh, it was not always a permanent condition. Fact 7. Women in Viking society had more rights and respect than women in many other medieval cultures, though Norse society was still firmly patriarchal. Free women could own property, inherit from their parents and husbands, and initiate divorce if their husbands mistreated them, failed to provide, or spent too much time away from home. They managed households and farms while men were away raiding, trading, or fighting. Some women achieved significant wealth and power, commemorated with elaborate burials that rival those of male warriors. The sagas feature strong female characters who influence events, offer counsel, and occasionally take up weapons. While women did not typically go Viking, they were essential to Norse society and culture. Fact 8. The Oseberg ship burial, discovered in Norway in 1904, contained the remains of 2 women buried with extraordinary wealth around the year 834. The ship itself was a magnificent vessel, richly carved with animal designs. Inside were found a decorated wooden cart for sledges, beds, chests, tapestries, kitchen equipment, and the bones of horses, dogs, and oxen. The identity of the women remains uncertain. One may have been a queen or priestess of high status. The other may have been a servant sacrificed to accompany her mistress. The Oseberg burial demonstrates that women could achieve the highest status in Norse society and that their deaths were commemorated with the same elaborate rituals accorded to powerful men. Fact 9. Marriage in Viking society was primarily an economic and political arrangement negotiated between families. The groom's family paid a bride price to the bride's family, while the bride brought a dowry that remained her property throughout the marriage. Weddings involved feasting, gift-giving, and rituals that might include the exchange of swords between families and the consecration of the union by invoking the gods, particularly Thor and Freya. After marriage, women wore their hair covered or bound to indicate their status. Divorce was relatively easy to obtain by either party, requiring witnesses and a formal declaration. Common grounds included physical abuse, financial irresponsibility, and incompatibility. Both parties could remarry after divorce. Fact 10. Children in Viking society were valued as the continuation of family and lineage. Infancy was dangerous, and many children did not survive their first years. Children were named 9 days after birth in a ceremony that may have involved sprinkling the child with water and giving it a name, often the name of a deceased ancestor. This naming created a connection to family history and possibly a belief in some form of rebirth. Children began learning adult skills early, with boys training in farming, fighting, and seamanship, while girls learned textile production, household management, and food preparation. By their early teens, children were considered capable of adult responsibilities. Fact 11. Norse religion was polytheistic, with a pantheon of gods and goddesses who inhabited a cosmos of 9 interconnected worlds. Unlike Christianity, there was no central religious authority, no holy book, and no formal creed. Religious practice varied by time, place, and individual. Some people devoted themselves primarily to one god, while acknowledging others. Worship involved sacrifices, feasts, and rituals conducted at sacred groves, temples, and household shrines. The gods were not morally perfect beings to be imitated, but powerful forces to be respected, appeased, and occasionally bargained with. The relationship between humans and gods was reciprocal, with offerings given in expectation of favor received. Fact 12. Odin, the Allfather, was the chief of the Norse gods, associated with war, wisdom, poetry, death, and magic. He was a complex and sometimes troubling figure, not the benevolent father god of later mythology, but a cunning, dangerous deity who valued knowledge above all else. Odin sacrificed one of his eyes at the well of Mimir to gain cosmic wisdom. He hung himself on the world tree Yggdrasil for 9 days and nights, pierced by his own spear, to learn the secrets of the runes. He wandered the worlds in disguise, seeking knowledge and manipulating events. Warriors hoped to be chosen by his Valkyries to join him in Valhalla, but Odin was fickle, sometimes abandoning his favorites at crucial moments. Fact 13. Thor was perhaps the most popular god among ordinary Vikings, the red-bearded god of thunder, who protected humanity from the giants who threatened cosmic order. Unlike the aristocratic and mysterious Odin, Thor was straightforward, strong, and reliable. He rode across the sky in a chariot pulled by goats, creating thunder with the rolling of its wheels. His hammer Mjolnir was the most famous weapon in Norse mythology, capable of leveling mountains and always returning to Thor's hand after being thrown. Thor was invoked for protection, his hammer symbol worn as an amulet, and his name given to Thursday, Thor's Day. He was the god of the common people, the farmers and craftsmen who made up most of Norse society. Fact 14. Loki was the trickster of Norse mythology, a figure of chaos and cunning who was both ally and enemy of the gods. He was blood brother to Odin and frequent companion to Thor, using his wits to help them out of difficulties he often caused in the first place. Loki was a shapeshifter who could become male or female, animal or human. In one famous story, he transformed into a mare and gave birth to Sleipnir, Odin's 8-legged horse. Loki's pranks grew darker over time. He caused the death of Baldur, the beloved god of light, and for this crime was bound beneath the earth with a serpent dripping venom on his face. His struggles cause earthquakes. At Ragnarok, he will break free to lead the forces of chaos against the gods. Fact 15. Freya was the goddess of love, beauty, fertility, and also of war and death. She was the most beautiful of the goddesses, desired by gods and giants alike, and she possessed a feathered cloak that allowed her to fly between worlds. Freya received half of all warriors slain in battle, taking them to her hall Folkvanger, while Odin took the other half to Valhalla. She was associated with a form of magic called seed, which involved trances, prophecy, and manipulation of fate. Freya wept tears of gold for her lost husband Odin, and she rode a chariot pulled by cats. Her name lives on in Friday, Freya's Day, though some scholars attribute the name to the goddess Frigg, Odin's wife, with whom Freya shares many characteristics. Fact 16. The Norse cosmos was organized around Yggdrasil, the great ash tree whose branches and roots connected 9 worlds. Asgard, home of the Aesir gods, sat at the top, connected to Midgard, the world of humans, by the rainbow bridge Bifrost. Below lay Niflheim, the cold realm of the dead ruled by Hel, Loki's daughter. Other worlds included Jotunheim, home of the giants, Vanaheim, home of the Vanir gods, Alfheim, home of the light elves, Svartalfheim, home of the dwarves, and Muspelheim, the realm of fire. The tree itself was constantly under attack, gnawed by serpents at its roots, but sustained by the 3 Norns who watered it from the well of fate. Fact 17. The Norns were 3 female beings who controlled the fate of gods and humans alike. Their names were Ord, meaning fate or what has happened, Verdandi, meaning becoming or what is happening, and Skuld, meaning debt or what shall be. They lived at the base of Yggdrasil and carved runes into its trunk that determined the destiny of all beings. Even the gods were subject to the Norns' decrees. This fatalistic worldview pervaded Norse culture. Death was not to be feared but accepted with courage, since one's fate was already determined. What mattered was how one faced that fate, with bravery and honor, earning a reputation that would outlive mortal life. Fact 18. Ragnarok, the doom of the gods, was the prophesied end of the Norse cosmos, a final battle between the gods and the forces of chaos. The events would begin with Fimbulwinter, 3 successive winters with no summer between them, during which human civilization would collapse into warfare and chaos. Then the wolves who had chased the sun and moon since the world's creation would finally catch and devour them. The world tree would shake, freeing Loki and the bound wolf Fenrir. The fire giant Surt would lead his forces from Muspelheim, and the sea would rise as the world serpent Jormungandr emerged from the ocean. In the final battle, Odin would be devoured by Fenrir, Thor would slay Jormungandr but die from its venom, and the world would sink into the sea and burn. Yet this was not the final end. The cosmos would be reborn, green and fertile, with surviving gods and humans creating a new and better world. Fact 19. The Vikings believed that warriors who died bravely in battle would be chosen by Odin's Valkyries to feast in Valhalla until Ragnarok. The Valkyries, whose name means choosers of the slain, were warrior women who served Odin, riding over battlefields to select the worthy dead. Valhalla itself was an enormous hall with 540 doors, each wide enough for 800 warriors to march through side by side. Every day, the chosen warriors would fight and kill each other in glorious combat. Every evening, they would rise healed to feast on the meat of a boar that regenerated every night and drink mead that flowed from the udders of a goat. This was the Viking heaven, an eternal warrior's paradise preparing for the final battle. Fact 20. Not all dead went to Valhalla. Those who died of illness, old age, or other non-heroic deaths went to Hel, the realm ruled by the goddess of the same name. Hel was Loki's daughter, described as half-beautiful woman, half-rotting corpse. Her realm was cold and gloomy, but not a place of punishment like the Christian Hell. It was simply where most dead people went, continuing a shadowy existence that gradually faded. The goddess Freya received some of the battle dead in her hall Folkvanger, and those who drowned at sea went to the underwater hall of the goddess Ran. The variety of afterlife destinations reflects the complexity of Norse beliefs, which were never systematized into a single consistent theology. Fact 21. Viking funerals varied enormously depending on the status of the deceased and local customs. The most famous type was the ship burial, in which the dead were laid in a ship, either buried in the ground or burned on a funeral pyre. The ship was equipped with grave goods including weapons, tools, jewelry, food, and drink for the journey to the afterlife. Animals, especially horses and dogs, might be sacrificed to accompany the dead. In some cases, slaves were killed to serve their masters in death. Not everyone received ship burial, which was reserved for the wealthy and powerful. Common people might be cremated, buried in simple graves, or interred under mounds with more modest grave goods. Fact 22. The Arab traveler Ahmad ibn Fadlan witnessed a Viking ship funeral on the Volga River around the year 922 and left a detailed, disturbing account. A chieftain had died, and a slave girl volunteered to accompany him in death. Over 10 days, she was treated as an honored guest, given intoxicating drinks, and ritually prepared for her fate. On the final day, she was led onto the funeral ship, had intercourse with several men who told her to tell their lord they did this for his honor, and was then stabbed and strangled by an old woman called the Angel of Death, while drums drowned out her screams. The ship was then burned, and a mound raised over the ashes. Ibn Fadlan found the ritual barbaric, but recorded it with remarkable ethnographic detail. Fact 23. Runes were the alphabet used by the Vikings and other Germanic peoples, consisting of angular letters designed to be carved into wood, stone, bone, or metal. The runic alphabet used during the Viking Age, called the Younger Futhark, had 16 characters representing both sounds and concepts. Runes were used for practical purposes like marking ownership or recording events, but they also had magical associations. According to mythology, Odin discovered the runes during his self-sacrifice on Yggdrasil, and knowledge of runes conferred power over fate and reality. Runic inscriptions have been found across the Viking world, from Scandinavia to Greenland, from the British Isles to Constantinople, where a Viking carved his name into the balcony of the Hagia Sophia. Fact 24. Runestones were large stones inscribed with runic texts, often raised to commemorate the dead or celebrate the achievements of the living. Most surviving runestones date from the late Viking Age and are concentrated in Sweden, where over 2,500 have been recorded. Typical inscriptions follow formulas like X raised this stone in memory of Y, his father, a good man. Some describe the deceased's travels, noting that they died in Greece or England or on the eastern roads to Russia. Others mention bridges or roads built by the commemorated person, acts of public service that benefited travelers. Runestones were monuments of personal and family pride, displaying wealth, literacy, and connections to the wider world. Fact 25. Viking longships were technological marvels that gave the Norsemen their greatest military and economic advantage. These sleek, shallow-draft vessels could cross open oceans, navigate shallow rivers, and be beached on any shore. They were fast under sail and could be rowed when wind failed or maneuvering was needed. A typical longship might be 70 to 100 feet long but only 15 feet wide, with a single mast carrying a square wool sail. The hull was built using the clinker method, with overlapping planks riveted together and made watertight with tarred wool or animal hair. The keel was carved from a single mass of timber, usually oak, providing strength and stability. Fact 26. The prow of a Viking warship often featured a carved dragon head or other fearsome figure designed to intimidate enemies and possibly ward off evil spirits. These figureheads were removable and were typically taken down when approaching friendly shores to avoid frightening the protective spirits of the land. The dragon ship, or drakar, became synonymous with Viking terror, its silhouette on the horizon announcing death and destruction to coastal communities throughout Europe. Yet for the Vikings themselves, these ships represented freedom and opportunity, the means to seek fortune, fame, and adventure across the seas. A man's ship was his most prized possession, often given a name and commemorated in poetry. Fact 27. Not all Viking ships were warships. The Nar was a cargo ship designed for long ocean voyages, wider and deeper than the longship, with a higher freeboard and more cargo capacity. Nars transported settlers, livestock, and goods across the North Atlantic to Iceland, Greenland, and beyond. They were slower than longships, but more seaworthy in heavy weather and could carry enough supplies for extended voyages. Smaller boats were used for fishing, local transport, and coastal trade. The Vikings built specialized vessels for different purposes, demonstrating sophisticated understanding of naval architecture and the varied demands of seafaring life. Fact 28. Navigation in the Viking Age was accomplished without compasses, which had not yet reached Europe from China. Viking navigators relied on knowledge of currents, winds, and wildlife, observing seabirds and whales that indicated proximity to land. They watched the sun and stars, using the position of the North Star and the height of the sun at noon to determine latitude. They may have used a device called a sun compass, a wooden disc with a vertical pointer that cast a shadow indicating direction. Some scholars believe they used crystals called sunstones that could locate the sun even on overcast days by polarizing light. Whatever their exact methods, Viking navigators successfully crossed the North Atlantic and reached America 500 years before Columbus. Fact 29. The Viking raids that began in the late 8th century were not random acts of violence, but strategic operations targeting wealthy, poorly defended sites. Monasteries were favorite targets because they accumulated treasure from donations and were inhabited by non-combatants who could not resist armed warriors. The raid on Lindisfarne in 793 was followed by attacks on Jarrow, Iona, and other religious houses. The Vikings quickly learned where the wealth was and how to extract it efficiently. They developed sophisticated tactics, using rivers to penetrate deep inland, establishing bases on coastal islands, and coordinating attacks across wide areas. What began as summer raiding expeditions eventually evolved into campaigns of conquest and settlement. Fact 30. The Great Heathen Army that invaded England in 865 was unlike previous Viking raids. This was a coordinated invasion force led by the sons of the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok, including Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan, and Ubbe. Over the following years, the army conquered the kingdoms of Northumbria, East Anglia, and Mercia, killing kings, and installing puppet rulers. Only Wessex, under King Alfred, successfully resisted. The great heathen army transformed England, establishing Viking-ruled territories that would become the Danelaw, an area where Danish law and custom prevailed. The invasion also transformed the Vikings themselves, as warriors who had come for plunder decided to stay, settling the land and establishing themselves as the new rulers of much of England. Fact 31. King Alfred of Wessex, later called Alfred the Great, was the only English monarch to successfully resist the Viking invasions and eventually turn the tide against them. At his lowest point, Alfred was a fugitive hiding in the marshes of Somerset, his kingdom seemingly lost. According to legend, he was so distracted by worry that he let a peasant woman's cakes burn, earning a scolding from someone who did not recognize her king. From this desperate situation, Alfred rallied his forces, defeated the Viking leader Guthrum at the Battle of Edington in 878, and negotiated a peace that confined the Vikings to the Danelaw. Alfred then reformed his military, built fortified towns called Buzz, and created a navy to defend his coasts. His descendants would eventually reconquer the Danelaw and unite England. Fact 32. The Danelaw was not a unified kingdom but a patchwork of Viking-controlled territories in eastern and northern England, characterized by Scandinavian law, language, and custom. 5 major towns, known as the Five Boroughs, Derby, Leicester, Lincoln, Nottingham, and Stamford, served as centers of Viking power. Place names throughout the region still reflect Scandinavian settlement, with endings like by meaning farm or village, Thorp meaning hamlet, and Thwaite meaning clearing appearing in hundreds of locations. Words from Old Norse entered the English language, including common terms like egg, knife, sky, window, and they. The Viking presence fundamentally shaped English language, law, and culture. Fact 33. Dublin was founded by Vikings around 841 as a long fort, a fortified ship camp that served as a base for raiding and trading. The city grew to become the most important Viking settlement in Ireland and a major hub of the Norse Atlantic world. From Dublin, Vikings raided throughout Ireland, extracting tribute and slaves, while also trading in goods from across Europe and beyond. Dublin was strategically located at the intersection of Irish sea trade routes, with connections to England, Scotland, Francia, and the wider Viking world. The city remained under Norse control for nearly 3 centuries, though frequently contested by Irish kings, until the Norman invasion of Ireland in the late 12th century. Fact 34. The slave trade was central to the Viking economy, with Dublin serving as one of the largest slave markets in Western Europe. Vikings captured slaves in raids throughout the British Isles and sold them to buyers from across the known world. Irish slaves were particularly numerous, transported not only to Scandinavia but also to the Islamic world via Viking trade networks. The Arabic word for slave, sakalaba, originally meant Slavic but was also applied to slaves from Western Europe. Viking merchants brought slaves to markets in Constantinople and Baghdad, where they commanded high prices. The scale of Viking slaving is difficult to estimate, but it certainly involved many thousands of people over the 3 centuries of the Viking Age. Fact 35. The Vikings who sailed east took a different path than those who went west, following rivers deep into the forests of what is now Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. These Vikings, known as the Rus, gave their name to Russia itself. They established trading posts along the Volga and Dnieper rivers, connecting the Baltic Sea with the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. Their most important settlement was at Kiev, which became the center of a powerful state known as Kievan Rus. From their eastern bases, Viking traders reached Constantinople, the magnificent capital of the Byzantine Empire, which they called Miklagard, the Great City. Some served as mercenaries in the Byzantine Emperor's elite Varangian Guard. Fact 36. The Varangian Guard was an elite military unit serving the Byzantine emperors, composed primarily of Vikings and later Anglo-Saxons who fled Norman-conquered England. The Guard served as personal bodyguards to the emperor, trusting foreigners with no local political entanglements to protect the throne. Varangians were famous for their loyalty, their ferocity in battle, and their enormous battle axes. They participated in campaigns across the Byzantine Empire, from Bulgaria to Syria, earning fame and fortune that attracted recruits from across the Norse world. Serving in the Varangian Guard was a prestigious accomplishment, celebrated in runic inscriptions that proudly record that men traveled to Greece and served in the emperor's household. Fact 37. Harald Hardrada, whose name means hard ruler, was one of the most famous Vikings to serve in the Varangian Guard. After fleeing Norway following a failed rebellion, Harald spent years in Byzantine service, fighting in campaigns from Sicily to Jerusalem and allegedly accumulating enormous wealth through both legitimate pay and questionable means. He eventually returned to Scandinavia, became King of Norway, and in 1066 launched an invasion of England to claim the English throne. Harold was killed at the Battle of Stamford Bridge by the forces of King Harold Godwinson, just days before Harold himself was killed by William the Conqueror at the Battle of Hastings. Harald Hardrada's death is often cited as the end of the Viking Age. Fact 38. The Vikings reached Iceland around 870, finding an island previously uninhabited except for some Irish monks who quickly departed. Over the following decades, thousands of settlers arrived from Norway, claiming land and establishing farms across the habitable coastal areas. Iceland was governed not by kings but by a system of chieftains and assemblies, culminating in the Althing, an annual gathering of all free men that served as both parliament and court. This system, established around 930, makes the Icelandic Althing one of the oldest surviving parliamentary institutions in the world. The Icelandic settlers brought with them the Norse language, religion, and culture, which they preserved and developed in ways that would eventually produce the great Icelandic sagas. Fact 39. The Icelandic sagas are among the greatest literary achievements of the medieval world, prose narratives written in Old Norse that tell stories of gods and heroes, feuds and adventures, love and loss. Most were written down in the 13th and 14th centuries, though they describe events from the Viking Age and draw on older oral traditions. The sagas range from mythological tales of the gods to family sagas following generations of Icelandic settlers to legendary sagas blending history with fantasy. They are remarkable for their realistic style, complex characters, and dry humor. Through the sagas, we have access to Viking culture and mentality in ways that are available for few other medieval societies. Fact 40. Eric the Red was an Icelandic Viking who was exiled for manslaughter and used his years of banishment to explore lands to the west that had been glimpsed by earlier sailors blown off course. Around 982, he reached a large island with habitable fjords along its southwestern coast. With a marketer's eye for branding, he named it Greenland, reasoning that people would be more willing to settle a place with an attractive name. When his exile ended, Eric returned to Iceland and recruited settlers for his discovery. In 985, a fleet of 25 ships set out for Greenland, though only 14 arrived. The survivors established 2 settlements that would persist for nearly 500 years. Fact 41. The Norse Greenland settlements, known as the Eastern and Western settlements, were the most remote outposts of European civilization for centuries. At their peak, they may have supported 5,000 people, living as farmers and hunters in the narrow habitable zones along the coast. The settlers raised cattle, sheep, and goats, hunted seals and caribou, and traded walrus ivory and polar bear furs for iron, timber, and other necessities from Europe. They built churches and eventually established a bishop's seat, maintaining their Christian faith at the edge of the known world. But Greenland was always marginal, vulnerable to climate change, changing trade patterns, and isolation from the wider world. Fact 42. Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, is credited with being the first European to reach the North American mainland around the year 1000. According to the sagas, Leif heard of lands sighted to the west by a trader named Bjarni Herjolfsson who had been blown off course. Leif purchased Bjarni's ship and sailed west, encountering 3 lands he named Helgeland, meaning flat stone land, probably Baffin Island, Markland, meaning forest land, probably Labrador, and Vinland, meaning wine land or meadowland, somewhere along the Atlantic coast of North America. Leif and his crew spent a winter in Vinland before returning to Greenland with a cargo of timber and possibly grapes. He never returned, but others would follow. Fact 43. The exact location of Vinland has been debated for centuries. The only confirmed Norse site in North America is Lance Aux Meadows in Newfoundland, discovered in 1960 and excavated over the following years. This site contains the remains of 8 Norse buildings, including a forge where iron was smelted, providing definitive proof that Vikings reached North America centuries before Columbus. However, Lance Aux Meadows does not match the saga descriptions of Vinland, with its wild grapes and mild winters. It was probably a temporary camp or way station rather than the Vinland of legend. The actual location of Vinland, if it was a specific place, remains unknown, with candidates ranging from Newfoundland to as far south as New England or beyond. Fact 44. Norse attempts to settle in North America ultimately failed. The sagas describe several expeditions to Vinland, including one led by Thorfinn Karlsefni that attempted to establish a permanent settlement. The settlers encountered indigenous peoples they called Skrælings, probably ancestors of the Inuit or Beothuk. Initial contact involved trade, but relations soon turned violent. After several years and several deaths, including from attacks by the Skrælings, the Norse abandoned their settlement and returned to Greenland. The distance from supply sources, the hostility of the indigenous population, and the small numbers of potential settlers all contributed to the failure. The Norse discovery of America would be forgotten in Europe until the sagas were rediscovered centuries later. Fact 45. The Greenland settlements began declining in the 14th century as the climate cooled and contact with Europe became increasingly sporadic. The last recorded ship from Greenland to Norway sailed in 1368. The last written record of the settlements is from 1408, describing a wedding at the church in Valsey, ruins of which still stand. After that, silence. When Europeans next visited Greenland in the 15th and 16th centuries, they found only empty farms and unburied dead. What happened to the Norse Greenlanders remains uncertain. They may have died of starvation, disease, or conflict with the Inuit who had been moving southward. Some may have emigrated to Iceland or North America. The end of Norse Greenland remains one of the enduring mysteries of Viking history. Fact 46. Viking warriors were not the berserker savages of popular imagination, but disciplined fighters who employed sophisticated tactics. They fought in formation, using interlocked shields to create a defensive wall that could withstand cavalry charges and missile fire. They coordinated their attacks, with leaders directing movements through horns, banners, and shouted commands. While individual valor was celebrated, success in battle depended on discipline and cooperation. The berserkers, warriors who worked themselves into a frenzied state before battle, were a real phenomenon but probably represented a small minority of Viking fighters. Most warriors relied on skill, training, and the support of their companions rather than uncontrolled rage. Fact 47. The shield wall, or skjoldborg, was the fundamental Viking battlefield formation. Warriors stood shoulder to shoulder, overlapping their round shields to create a nearly continuous barrier. The front rank would hold the wall, while those behind thrust spears over their shoulders at the enemy. If the wall held, it was nearly impervious to frontal assault. Breaking a shield wall required either flanking attacks, missile fire to disrupt the formation, or prolonged pressure that exhausted the defenders. The shield wall was both a defensive formation and a platform for offense, advancing in unison to push back the enemy. Its effectiveness depended on the courage and discipline of the warriors who held it. Fact 48. Viking weapons were both practical tools of war and symbols of status and identity. Swords were the most prestigious weapons, expensive to make and often passed down through generations. A good sword was given a name and celebrated in poetry. The typical Viking sword was a double-edged weapon about 35 inches long, designed for slashing more than thrusting. But swords were not the most common weapon. Most warriors carried spears, which were cheaper to produce and effective in the shield wall. Axes, both single-handed and the fearsome two-handed Dane axe, were also popular. Wealthy warriors might carry all three, using different weapons for different tactical situations. Fact 49. Viking shields were typically round, about 3 feet in diameter, made from wooden planks with an iron boss in the center protecting the hand grip. The wood was usually linden or fir, light but strong enough to absorb weapon strikes. Shields were often painted in bright colors, with some historical accounts describing patterns and symbols that might indicate allegiance or personal identity. A shield was essential for survival in Viking combat, used actively to deflect blows, push opponents off balance, and create openings for counterattacks. Shields were not meant to last. They were damaged and destroyed in combat, but they kept their owners alive long enough to strike back. Fact 50. Helmets were worn by Viking warriors who could afford them, but they did not have horns. The horn helmet is a modern myth, originating in 19th century artistic and theatrical depictions. Actual Viking helmets were simple iron or leather caps designed to protect the skull from blows. The most famous surviving example, the Jernmundbo helmet from Norway, features a rounded cap with a nose guard but no horns. Horns would have been impractical in combat, providing handholds for opponents and adding weight without protection. The Vikings decorated many things, but their helmets were functional rather than ornamental. Fact 51. Armor was expensive and therefore not universal among Viking warriors. The most common protection was a mail shirt or brynja, made from thousands of interlocking iron rings. A well-made mail shirt could stop sword cuts and deflect arrows, though it provided less protection against crushing blows. Mail was so valuable that it was often mentioned specifically in wills and inherited as prized possessions. Poorer warriors might wear padded leather or simply fight in their ordinary clothes. Wealthy leaders might have mail covering their arms and legs, as well as their torsos. The possession of good armor was both a military advantage and a mark of status. Fact 52. The Vikings produced some of the finest metalwork in medieval Europe. Viking blacksmiths forged swords using pattern welding, a technique that combined different types of iron and steel to create blades that were both hard and flexible. The patterns visible on the blade were not just decorative, but indicated the quality of the smithing. Jewelry makers created intricate designs in gold, silver, and bronze, using techniques including filigree, granulation, and casting. Animal motifs dominated Viking art, with stylized beasts intertwining in complex patterns. The skills of Viking craftsmen were valued throughout Europe, and their products were traded far beyond the Norse world. Fact 53. The Vikings developed distinctive art styles that evolved throughout the Viking Age. The earliest style, called the Oseberg or Broa style, features gripping beasts, small creatures whose limbs and bodies intertwine while gripping the borders of the design. Later styles include the boar style with its ring chain patterns, the gelling style with its ribbon-shaped animals, the mammon style with more naturalistic creatures, and the ringerike and un styles that show increasing elegance and Christian influence. These styles appear on everything from weapons and jewelry to ships and buildings. The evolution of Viking art styles helps archaeologists date objects and trace cultural connections across the Norse world. Fact 54. Viking houses were built using techniques suited to the harsh, northern climate. The typical longhouse was a rectangular building with a timber frame and walls of turf, earth, or stacked stones, depending on local materials. The roof was usually thatched or covered with turf, which provided excellent insulation. Inside, a long central hearth provided heat and light, with smoke escaping through holes in the roof or simply filtering through the thatch. Raised platforms along the walls served as benches during the day and beds at night. The longhouse was home to the extended family, and in some cases, their animals as well, whose body heat helped warm the interior during the long winter nights. Fact 55. The Great Hall was the centerpiece of a Viking chief's or king's establishment, a larger version of the longhouse that served as a public space for feasting, meetings, and ceremony. The Great Hall was where a leader demonstrated his wealth and generosity, hosting feasts where followers received gifts of weapons, jewelry, and other valuables. These gifts created bonds of loyalty that were essential to Norse political organization. The hall was also where important decisions were made, disputes settled, and visitors received. A leader without a hall could not be a proper leader. The destruction of an enemy's hall was a symbolic as well as practical victory, destroying the center of his power. Fact 56. Viking feasts were important social and political events where communities gathered to eat, drink, and reinforce social bonds. Feasts marked religious festivals, seasonal transitions, funerals, weddings, and important political occasions. They might last for days, with enormous quantities of meat, fish, bread, and especially alcohol consumed. Mead, made from fermented honey, and ale, made from fermented grain, were the primary beverages. Drunkenness was expected and socially acceptable at feasts, though the violence that sometimes resulted was not. Poetry and storytelling were essential feast entertainments, with skilled poets earning fame and rewards for their compositions. A successful feast demonstrated a host's wealth, generosity, and ability to maintain social order. Fact 57. Hospitality was a sacred duty in Viking society, and failure to provide hospitality to travelers was a serious social failing. The Norse world was connected by long and dangerous journeys, and travelers depended on the hospitality of strangers for shelter, food, and protection. Hosts were expected to provide for their guests' needs and protect them from harm, while guests were expected to behave respectfully and not overstay their welcome. The customs of hospitality created networks of obligation that facilitated travel, trade, and the spread of information across vast distances. Even enemies might be entitled to hospitality under certain circumstances, and violating guest right was considered dishonorable. Fact 58. Poetry was central to Viking culture, serving as entertainment, historical record, and political tool. The skalds, professional poets who served at the courts of kings and chieftains, composed elaborate verses celebrating their patrons' victories and virtue. Skaldic poetry used complex meters and kennings, metaphorical phrases that required deep knowledge to understand. Calling a sword a wound hoe or the sea the whale road demonstrated the poet's skill and the audience's sophistication. Poetry was composed to commemorate battles, insult enemies, and win the favor of the powerful. A skilled skald could earn wealth and fame. A poor one might earn contempt or worse. Fact 59. The Eddic poems, preserved primarily in Icelandic manuscripts, provide our most detailed sources for Norse mythology. These poems, composed by anonymous authors and transmitted orally for generations before being written down, tell stories of the gods and heroes of the Norse world. The Völuspá, or Prophecy of the Seeress, describes the creation and destruction of the world. The Havamal, or Sayings of the High One, offers wisdom attributed to Odin. Other poems tell the stories of heroes like Sigurd the Dragon Slayer, whose legend influenced later works including Wagner's Ring Cycle and Tolkien's novels. The Eddic poems preserve a worldview that was fading even as they were written down, a window into pre-Christian Norse beliefs. Fact 60. The conversion of the Vikings to Christianity was a gradual process that took place over several centuries. Danish kings began accepting baptism in the 9th century, though the sincerity of early conversions was often questionable. Norway was Christianized in the late 10th and early 11th centuries through a combination of missionary work and royal pressure, including significant violence against those who refused to convert. Sweden was the last Scandinavian country to fully convert, with paganism persisting in some areas until the 12th century. Iceland converted collectively in the year 1000, when the law speaker at the Althing announced that all Icelanders would become Christian to preserve social unity, though pagans were allowed to continue worshipping privately. Fact 61. The process of conversion transformed Scandinavian society in profound ways. The Church brought literacy, as monks taught reading and writing and established schools. It brought new forms of art and architecture, as Scandinavians learned to build in stone and adopted continental artistic styles. It brought new laws, as Christian morality influenced legal codes and church courts gained jurisdiction over matters like marriage and inheritance. It brought new connections, as Scandinavian kingdoms became part of the broader Christian community of European states. And it brought the end of many traditional practices, including human sacrifice, cremation burial, and the worship of the old gods. Yet elements of the old ways persisted, incorporated into folk beliefs and practices that survived alongside Christianity for centuries. Fact 62. Viking influence shaped the political development of many parts of Europe. In France, the Viking leader Rollo was granted the territory that became Normandy, land of the Northmen, in 911. His descendants would eventually conquer England in 1066, creating an Anglo-Norman realm that dominated medieval Britain. In Russia, the Rurikid dynasty founded by the Viking Rurik ruled from the 9th century until 1598. In Sicily, Norman adventurers, themselves descendants of Vikings, established a kingdom that blended Norse, Arab, and Greek cultures. In Ireland, Scotland, and the islands of the North Atlantic, Viking settlement left lasting marks on populations, languages, and place names that are still visible today. Fact 63. The Norman conquest of England in 1066 was, in a sense, the last great Viking invasion, launched by descendants of the Vikings who had settled in France. William, Duke of Normandy, claimed the English throne based on a promise allegedly made by King Edward the Confessor. When the throne went instead to Harold Godwin's son, William invaded. The timing was fortunate, as Harold had just force-marched his army north to defeat the invasion of Harold Hardrada, the last great Viking king, at Stamford Bridge. Exhausted, Harold's army then marched south to meet William at Hastings. The English were defeated, Harold was killed, and England passed from Anglo-Saxon to Norman rule, an event that reshaped English language, law, and society. Fact 64. The legacy of the Vikings in the English language extends far beyond the place names of the Danelaw. Common English words derived from Old Norse include anger, awkward, bag, birth, both, cake, call, cast, clip, crawl, die, dirt, dregs, egg, fellow, flat, gap, get, gift, give, guess, gun, gust, hap, happy, hit, husband, ill, kid, knife, law, leg, lift, likely, link, loose, slow, meek, muck, muggy, odd, race, rag, raise, ransack, root, rotten, sake, same, scale, scare, score, seat, seam, sister, skill, skin, skirt, skull, sky, slant, slaughter, sly, smile, snare, snub, sprint, stagger, stain, stake, steer, stern, take they their, them, though, thrift, thrust, tight, till, trust, ugly, want, weak, window, wing, and wrong. The Vikings left their words embedded in the language we speak every day. Fact 65. Viking women who stayed home while men went raiding or trading were responsible for running farms, managing households, and making decisions in their husband's absence. They held the keys to household stores, a responsibility symbolized by the keys that women wore at their belts. Archaeological evidence shows that women were buried with symbols of their domestic authority, including keys, weaving equipment, and jewelry that displayed their status. While the sagas focus largely on male adventures, they also portray women as significant actors who advised, influenced, and sometimes goaded men into action. The Norse concept of honor was a family matter, and women were expected to uphold and defend family honor alongside men. Fact 66. Textile production was one of the most important economic activities in Norse society, and it was primarily women's work. Women spun thread from wool or linen using drop spindles, a skill learned in childhood and practiced throughout life. They wove cloth on large upright looms, producing fabrics for clothing, sails, tents, and trade. A Viking sail required enormous amounts of cloth, potentially years of work for a skilled weaver. High-quality textiles were valuable trade goods, exchanged for the precious metals and exotic goods that flowed into Scandinavia. The humble work of spinning and weaving was thus essential to both domestic life and the wider Viking economy. Fact 67. Viking ships required vast quantities of woolen sailcloth, and producing this cloth was a major undertaking. A single large sail might require the wool of 200 sheep and thousands of hours of labor to process, spin, dye, weave, and finish. The wool had to be carded, combed, and spun into thread, then woven on large looms in strips that were sewn together to create the full sail. The finished cloth was treated with animal fat to make it more resistant to water and wind. The labor of women in producing sailcloth was thus directly connected to the success of Viking voyages, though this contribution has often been overlooked in favor of the more dramatic activities of men. Fact 68. The Vikings ate a varied diet based on agriculture, animal husbandry, hunting, fishing, and foraging. Grains, especially barley and oats, were made into porridge and bread. Cattle, sheep, goats, and pigs provided meat and dairy products. Fish, both freshwater and marine, were caught, dried, and salted for preservation. Wild game, including deer, elk, and seabirds, supplemented domesticated animals. Berries, nuts, and wild plants were gathered when in season. In coastal areas, seals and whales were hunted for meat, fat, and oil. The long northern winters required careful food preservation, with drying, smoking, salting, and fermenting used to make food last until the next growing season. Fact 69. Fermentation was an important food preservation technique, producing not only alcoholic beverages, but also preserved foods like sauerkraut and fermented fish. The most extreme example of fermented fish is hakarl, shark meat that has been buried and allowed to rot for several months before being eaten. This dish, still traditional in Iceland, has an extremely strong ammonia smell that most outsiders find revolting. For people living in harsh northern environments with limited options for food preservation, fermentation made otherwise inedible foods edible and provided essential nutrients during the long winter. The taste for fermented foods persists in Scandinavian cuisine today, a legacy of Viking-era necessity. Fact 70. Skyr is a traditional Icelandic dairy product that dates back to the Viking Age, made by straining the whey from milk that has been fermented with specific cultures. The result is thick, creamy, and high in protein, similar to Greek yogurt, but with its own distinctive taste. Skyr was an important food source for Icelandic settlers, providing nutrition that could be stored and consumed throughout the year. The specific bacterial cultures used to make traditional skyr have been passed down for over 1,000 years, a living link to Viking-era foodways. In recent decades, skyr has become popular internationally, marketed as a healthy dairy product with ancient Nordic roots. Fact 71. The Vikings practiced both cremation and inhumation burial, with customs varying by time, place, and individual circumstance. Cremation was common in the early Viking Age and in some regions throughout the period, with the ashes buried in urns or scattered. The funeral pyre was believed to release the soul for its journey to the afterlife, and burning possessions ensured they would accompany the deceased. Inhumation, burying the intact body, became more common over time, especially as Christianity spread. The grandest inhumation burials featured ships, either actual vessels or boat-shaped stone settings, equipped with everything the deceased might need in the afterlife. Both types of burial might be marked by mounds, standing stones, or other monuments. Fact 72. Grave goods buried with the Viking dead reveal much about their lives and beliefs. Wealthy individuals were buried with weapons, jewelry, tools, animals, and sometimes slaves. These goods were not merely honoring the dead, but provisioning them for the afterlife. A warrior needed his weapons, a craftsman needed his tools, a woman needed her weaving equipment and keys. Food and drink were provided for the journey. Horses and dogs were sacrificed to serve and accompany their owners. The selection of grave goods reflected both the individual's identity and their family's wealth and status. Poorer graves contain fewer goods, but even modest burials often include something to equip the dead for their journey. Fact 73. The Gokstad ship, discovered in a burial mound in Norway in 1880, is one of the best-preserved Viking ships ever found. Built around 890, it was used as a burial vessel for a wealthy chieftain who was interred with weapons, riding equipment, and the skeletons of horses and dogs. The ship itself is a magnificent example of Viking shipbuilding, about 76 feet long and 17 feet wide, capable of carrying a crew of over 30 and a substantial cargo. In 1893, a replica of the Gokstad ship sailed across the Atlantic to the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, demonstrating that Viking ships were indeed capable of making ocean voyages to America. Fact 74. The Jelling stones in Denmark are among the most important monuments of the Viking Age, erected by King Gorm the Old and his son Harald Bluetooth in the 10th century. The smaller stone, raised by Gorm, commemorates his wife Thyra and is the oldest royal inscription in Denmark. The larger stone, raised by Harald, declares that Harald won for himself all of Denmark and Norway and made the Danes Christian. One face bears an image of Christ, the earliest known depiction of Christ in Scandinavia. The Jelling stones mark the transition of Denmark from a pagan to a Christian kingdom and the establishment of the royal dynasty that would rule Denmark for centuries. They are now a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Fact 75. Harald Bluetooth, who erected the larger Jelling stone, gave his name to modern Bluetooth wireless technology. The inventors were searching for a name that suggested unification, as their technology was meant to unify communications protocols, and Harald was famous for uniting Denmark and Norway. The Bluetooth logo is a combination of Harald's runic initials. This seemingly random connection between a 10th century Viking king and 21st century technology illustrates how the Vikings continue to capture modern imagination. Their names, symbols, and stories appear throughout contemporary culture, from technology brands to sports teams to popular entertainment. Fact 76. Knut the Great, also known as Canute, ruled an empire that included England, Denmark, Norway, and parts of Sweden in the early 11th century, the greatest extent of any Viking ruler's power. Knut was the son of the Danish king Sweyn Forkbeard, who had conquered England shortly before his death. Knut inherited his father's conquests and expanded them, creating a North Sea empire that dominated the region. He is famous today for a story, probably legendary, in which he set his throne by the sea and commanded the tide to halt, demonstrating to flattering courtiers that even kings could not control the forces of nature. In reality, Knut was a shrewd and effective ruler who maintained his diverse realms through a combination of military power, political skill, and strategic marriages. Fact 77. The end of the Viking Age is traditionally dated to 1066, when both Harald Hardrada's invasion of England and the era of Scandinavian expansion came to an end. But the Vikings did not simply disappear. They had transformed from pagan raiders into Christian kingdoms integrated into the broader European political and religious community. Denmark, Norway, and Sweden developed into the nations that still exist today. The Viking settlements across the North Atlantic evolved into distinct societies with their own identities. Iceland preserved the language and literature of the Viking Age more completely than anywhere else, becoming a treasury of Norse culture. The Viking Age ended, but its legacy continued. Fact 78. The modern image of Vikings has been shaped by centuries of myth-making, beginning with medieval chronicles that portrayed them as savage pagans and continuing through romantic 19th century revivals that celebrated them as heroic adventurers. The horned helmets, the drinking from skulls, the berserker fury, these popular images have little basis in historical reality. Yet the fascination with Vikings persists, inspiring novels, films, television series, and video games. The real Vikings were complex people, neither the monsters of monastic chronicles nor the noble savages of romantic imagination, but farmers and traders, warriors and poets, explorers and settlers who shaped the medieval world. Fact 79. Genetic studies have revealed that Viking expansion left lasting marks on populations across Europe and the North Atlantic. Many people in Britain, Ireland, Iceland, and other areas of Viking settlement carry DNA that traces back to Scandinavian ancestors. The genetic evidence confirms that Vikings did not simply raid but settled, intermarried with local populations, and left descendants who still live in these regions today. The studies also reveal complexity that challenges simple narratives, with evidence of migration, intermarriage, and cultural exchange flowing in multiple directions. The Vikings were not a pure race, but a diverse people who mixed with others wherever they went. Fact 80. The Icelandic sagas continue to be read and studied today, valued both as historical sources and as literary masterpieces. Saga heroes like Egil Skallagrimsson, Njal Thorgeirsson, and Grettir the Strong are complex characters whose stories explore themes of honor, fate, family, and the struggle to maintain dignity in a world of violence and uncertainty. The sagas have influenced countless later writers, from William Morris to J.R.R. Tolkien to George R.R. Martin. They preserve a voice from the Viking Age itself, filtered through later Christian writers, but still echoing with the values and worldview of the Norse. Reading the sagas is the closest we can come to hearing the Vikings tell their own stories. Fact 81. Ragnar Lothbrok is one of the most famous Vikings, celebrated in saga, television, and popular imagination. According to legend, he was a Danish king who raided England and France, fought a serpent to win his first wife, and eventually died in a snake pit in the hands of King Aella of Northumbria. His sons, including Ivar the Boneless, Bjorn Ironside, and Ub, led the great heathen army that invaded England in revenge for their father's death. Whether Ragnar was a real historical figure, a composite of several different people, or largely legendary is debated. But his story, with its blend of adventure, romance, and violent death, captures much of what makes the Viking Age so compelling. Fact 82. Ivar the Boneless, son of Ragnar Lothbrok, was one of the leaders of the great heathen army and one of the most feared Vikings of his time. His nickname has inspired much speculation. Some theories suggest he suffered from a bone disease that made his legs weak or brittle. Others interpret boneless as a metaphor for exceptional flexibility or cunning. Still others suggest it was an ironic nickname, as his bones were clearly strong enough for him to be a formidable warrior. According to the sagas, Ivar orchestrated the Blood Eagle execution of King Aella in revenge for his father's death, a gruesome ritual killing whose historicity is debated. Ivar died in Dublin in 873, remembered as one of the great war leaders of the Viking Age. Fact 83. The Blood Eagle was a form of execution described in Norse sagas and poetry, in which the victim's ribs were cut from the spine, pulled outward to resemble wings, and the lungs extracted while the victim was still alive. Whether this horrifying ritual was ever actually performed or was purely literary invention is debated by historians. Some argue that the detailed descriptions in multiple sources suggest a basis in fact. Others note that the earliest accounts are ambiguous and that the full gruesome ritual only appears in later sources that may have elaborated on earlier hints. The Blood Eagle represents the extreme edge of Viking violence, whether as historical fact or as literary expression of their fearsome reputation. Fact 84. Bjorn Ironside, another son of Ragnar Lothbrok, supposedly led a remarkable raid into the Mediterranean around 859. According to the sources, Bjorn and his fleet sailed through the Strait of Gibraltar, raided along the coasts of Spain, North Africa, and southern France, sacked the city of Luna in Italy, possibly mistaking it for Rome, and eventually returned to Scandinavia laden with plunder. The journey would have covered thousands of miles and demonstrated both the range of Viking navigation and the vulnerability of Mediterranean coasts to determined raiders. Bjorn is traditionally considered the founder of the Swedish Munso dynasty, though his historical existence is as uncertain as his father's. Fact 85. The Vikings encountered many different peoples in their travels, and their interactions ranged from violent conflict to peaceful trade to intermarriage and assimilation. They fought Anglo-Saxons and Franks, Irish and Scots, Slavs and Byzantines. They traded with Arabs and exchanged silver and slaves along routes stretching from Scandinavia to Baghdad. They encountered indigenous peoples in North America, the Skraelings of the sagas, and were eventually driven away by their resistance. The Vikings were not an isolated people but active participants in a connected medieval world, exchanging goods, ideas, and genes with diverse cultures across Europe, Asia, and the Americas. Fact 86. Arab and Muslim travelers left valuable accounts of the Vikings they encountered. Ibn Fadlan, whose description of a ship funeral was mentioned earlier, also recorded his impressions of the Rus Vikings he met on the Volga. He described them as the filthiest of God's creatures, noting their lack of personal hygiene compared to Muslim standards, yet also admired their physical appearance, comparing them to palm trees. Other Arab sources describe trade with the Vikings, their goods and customs, and their role in the broader medieval economy. These outside perspectives provide important counterbalances to the Scandinavian sources, offering glimpses of how the Vikings appeared to those they encountered. Fact 87. Silver was the primary form of wealth in the Viking economy, accumulated through trade, tribute, and plunder. Vikings measured silver by weight rather than by coin, cutting up coins, jewelry, and ingots to make exact payments. This hack-silver economy meant that the origin of the silver mattered less than its weight and purity. Hoards of Viking silver have been found across Scandinavia and the Viking world, buried for safekeeping and never recovered, perhaps because their owners died before they could return. These hoards contain coins from across Europe and the Islamic world, evidence of the far-flung trade networks that brought wealth flowing into Scandinavia. Fact 88. The Vikings minted their own coins starting in the 9th century, initially imitating foreign designs and eventually developing distinctive Scandinavian styles. Early coins were produced in trading centers like Hedeby and Birka, facilitating commerce in these bustling markets. As Scandinavian kingdoms developed, kings began minting coins as expressions of royal authority. The famous coins of Knut the Great, minted in England during his reign, bear his name and title, proclaiming his power across his domains. Coins provide valuable evidence for trade patterns, political claims, and artistic styles, small objects that carry big information about Viking Age economics and politics. Fact 89. Hedeby, located in what is now northern Germany, was one of the largest and most important trading centers of the Viking Age. Situated at the base of the Jutland Peninsula, it connected overland and maritime trade routes linking the Baltic and North Seas. Merchants from across Europe gathered there to exchange goods including furs, amber, slaves, weapons, textiles, and glassware. The town had a substantial permanent population of craftsmen and traders, protected by a semicircular rampart and a harbor that could accommodate numerous ships. Hedeby was mentioned in contemporary sources as a major center of commerce and was a target for rival powers. It was destroyed in 1066 and never rebuilt, replaced by nearby Schleswig. Fact 90. Birka, located on an island in Lake Mälar in Sweden, was another major Viking trading center, flourishing from around 750 to 975. Archaeological excavations have revealed a diverse trading community with goods from across Eurasia, including silk from China, glassware from the Mediterranean, and furs from the Arctic. The town's population lived in small houses crowded along narrow streets, protected by a fortress and a defensive wall. Birka's location on an island made it easily defensible and accessible by water, key advantages for a trading center in an age of widespread raiding. The town was abandoned in the late 10th century for unknown reasons, its trade shifting to other centers. Fact 91. The Vikings believed in a variety of supernatural beings beyond the major gods, including elves, dwarves, giants, and spirits of the land and sea. Elves, or Alfar, were powerful beings associated with fertility and nature, sometimes helpful and sometimes dangerous. Dwarves, or Dvergr, were master craftsmen who forged the treasures of the gods, including Thor's hammer and Odin's spear. Giants, or Jotnar, were the ancient enemies of the gods, forces of chaos and destruction that would eventually overwhelm the world at Ragnarok. Land spirits, or Landvetter, inhabited specific places and needed to be respected to ensure good fortune. This populated supernatural world required careful navigation, with rituals and offerings maintaining good relations with beings who could help or harm. Fact 92. Magic and supernatural power were real forces in the Viking worldview, accessible through specific practices and knowledge. Cedar was a form of magic associated with the god Odin, and especially the goddess Freya, involving trances, prophecy, and manipulation of fate. It was primarily practiced by women, and men who practiced it were considered unmanly, though Odin himself was its greatest practitioner. Galdr was magic through song and chant, using the power of words and poetry to affect reality. Rune magic used the power of the runic symbols, which had been discovered by Odin through his self-sacrifice. These magical practices coexisted with practical efforts to influence events, complementing rather than replacing physical action. Fact 93. Volvas, or seeresses, were women with the gift of prophecy who traveled between communities offering their services. When a Volva arrived, she would be hosted with honor and given a feast. She would then enter a trance, often while seated on a high platform, and prophesy about the coming year, the fate of individuals who asked questions, and other matters of concern. The Volva in the Eddic poem Völuspá speaks prophecy about the entire history and future of the cosmos, from creation to Ragnarok and beyond. Whether Volvas were actual practitioners or literary ideals, they represent the importance of prophecy and hidden knowledge in Norse culture and the special role of certain women in accessing supernatural wisdom. Fact 94. The transition from paganism to Christianity was not sudden but gradual, with many people maintaining beliefs and practices from both traditions during a long period of transition. Christian missionaries had to accommodate existing customs, incorporating pre-Christian festivals into the church calendar and sometimes tolerating practices that they could not eliminate. Churches were sometimes built on or near former pagan sacred sites. Runic inscriptions show prayers to Christ alongside traditional formulas. Some individuals may have genuinely converted, while others simply added Christ to their existing pantheon of gods. The process of Christianization took generations, and elements of pre-Christian belief persisted in folk custom long after official conversion. Fact 95. The stave churches of Norway represent a unique architectural tradition that developed after the Viking Age, but reflects the skill in woodworking that the Vikings had mastered. These churches, constructed entirely of wood using advanced joinery techniques, feature dramatic vertical lines and elaborate carvings that blend Christian and pre-Christian motifs. The dragons that adorn some stave church roofs recall the dragon-headed prows of Viking longships. Of the perhaps 1,000 stave churches built in medieval Norway, only about 30 survive today, preserved as remarkable examples of Scandinavian craftsmanship. They represent the continuation of Viking-era skills into the Christian period, creating something new from ancient traditions. Fact 96. The legacy of the Vikings extends far beyond their historical period. Their explorations opened the North Atlantic and reached America centuries before Columbus. Their raids and conquests reshaped the political map of medieval Europe. Their settlements left permanent marks on populations, languages, and cultures from Russia to Normandy to the British Isles. Their art and literature continue to inspire. Their mythology has become part of global culture, from Marvel movies to heavy metal music to fantasy novels. The Vikings have become symbols of adventure, freedom, and warrior spirit, even if the reality was more complex than the legend. Fact 97. Tonight, as you drift toward sleep, imagine yourself once more aboard a Viking longship. The wind fills the sail, and the ship glides across the gray northern sea. Around you, warriors rest at their oars, their weapons close at hand, their eyes on the horizon. You might be sailing toward danger or opportunity, toward a foreign shore where treasure waits, or toward home and the family who waits for your return. The stars will overhead, the same stars that guided countless voyages across unknown seas. The ship rises and falls on the swells, a rhythm as old as the ocean itself. Fact 98. The Vikings believed that fate was woven by the Norns, that every person's destiny was determined before birth. What mattered was not whether you could escape your fate, but how you met it. A man who faced death with courage earned a reputation that would outlive him. A coward who fled would be remembered with contempt. The highest aspiration was to die well, sword in hand, earning a place in Valhalla and a name that would be spoken for generations. In a world where life was short and death could come at any moment, reputation was the only immortality, and honor was worth more than life. Fact 99. And so the Vikings pass into history, their raids and kingdoms, their ships and gods, their heroes and legends fading into the mists of time. But they are not truly gone. They live on in the languages we speak, the places we inhabit, the stories we tell. They live on in the genetic inheritance of millions of descendants across Europe and the Americas. They live on in our fascination with their world, our endless appetite for tales of their adventures. As you drift toward dreams, carry with you the spirit of the Vikings, the courage to face whatever tomorrow brings, the curiosity to seek what lies beyond the horizon, and the wisdom to know that reputation is earned by deeds, not words. Sleep well, voyager. The longship sails on through the eternal sea, carrying the spirits of warriors and explorers, poets and kings, towards shores that exist only in dreams. The dragon prow faces forward, into the unknown, into the darkness that holds both danger and wonder. The stars guide the way, as they always have, as they always will. And somewhere beyond the horizon, the journey continues forever.